Okej, klockan är 8:30. Hej och välkomna allihopa till vårt seminarium Mangrove med positiva ringar på vattnet. Kolinlagring med positiva ringar på vattnet. Jag heter Ida Åberg-Bersén och jag jobbar som klimatstrateg på Zero Mission. Idag så vi på Zero Mission har haft seminarium sedan 2008 och sedan förra året så har vi gått över till att ha digitala seminarium. Idag så kommer vi få en presentation av först av min vd Claire Wigg, men sen också av Mark Huxham som jobbar som forskare på Edinburgh Napier University. Och sen kommer vi också få en hälsning från Moana Rusi Moana Africa som sitter som projektsamordnare för Blue Vanga-projektet i Kenya. Och eftersom att uppkopplingen är lite svajig från Kenya så har vi valt att spela in intervjun med Moana Rusi på förhand. Så den kommer vi få lyssna på sen. Men först lite praktikaliteter. För att få lite interaktion med er den här morgonen så skulle jag jättegärna vilja att ni skriver in i chatten varifrån ni kommer och vad ni tänker på när ni hör ordet blue carbon. Och medan ni gör det så vill jag passa på att välkomna in min vd Claire Wigg som kommer att hålla en liten presentation först om oss på Zero Mission och berätta lite om vad man som företag kan fokusera på om man vill använda klimatkompensation som en del av sin klimatstrategi.
Tack så mycket. Jag kommer att dela min skärm. Så här. Så, hoppas den ser bra ut. God morgon allihopa. Jag som sagt är vd för Zero Mission som är ett företag som har funnits sedan 2006. Idag är vi 11 personer som jobbar med klimatstrategier åt företag, mest i Sverige. Min roll idag är att ge er en kort överblick in till klimatkompensation. Varför behövs det? Vad är det? Och hur kan man tänka kring kvalitet om man vill börja klimatkompensera? Jag kommer då till första frågan. Varför behövs klimatkompensation? Det korta svaret är att klimatförändring har börjat. Fler och fler personer drabbas av den redan idag och vi behöver göra allt nu för att undvika en situation som blir allvarligt för alla. Det betyder att vi måste alla minska, binda och undvika utsläpp så mycket det redan går idag. Bilden som man ser här från Malawi visar kvinnor som behöver gå längre än förut för att hämta vatten på grund av att det finns inget vatten längre i lokala flöden. Det är en tecken på klimatförändring. Ett annat sätt att visualisera hur läget ser ut idag i siffror. Och jag valde den här bilden som är en ganska kort enkel version av den emissionsgapet diagram. Den versionen gjordes 2019 och situationen idag är tyvärr även sämre. Vi behöver vara på den turkoslinjen längst ned ut till höger för att klara maximum 1,5 graders uppvärmning. Men idag är vi uppe kring den gröna och röda linjerna istället. Den röda linjen representerar allting som länder globalt har sagt att de skulle kunna göra för att minska deras utsläpp. Men som du ser på högersidan finns en stor gap av många gigaton CO2-utsläpp mellan de prognoserna. Och där inne kommer klimatkompensation. Klimatkompensation är en dellösningen, inte hela lösningen såklart, men en dellösningen för att minska den emissionsgapet. Man kan se på klimatkompensation som ett verktyg och möjliggöra kanske en Swiss Army knife. Klimatkompensation kan möjliggöra finansiering av projekt som minskar, undviker och avlägsna utsläpp. Och den görs på platser var pengarna inte finns annars. Och klimatkompensation är något som man kan börja med idag, här och nu. Och för företag som klimatkompenserar finns positiva effekter från att man tvingas att göra en räkning. Man tvingas att få ordning på vad företaget har för utsläpp. Samt finns möjlighet att vara i framkant i en bransch med klimatkompensation som en del av en klimatstrategi. Och man kan använda klimatkompensation i marknadsföring så länge som det görs på rätt sätt. Så många möjligheter. Det har sagts att klimatkompensation görs av företag för att köpa sig fria, men det är inte alls vår erfarenhet. Tvärtom faktiskt. Och med den menar jag att företag som klimatkompenserar är ofta de företagen som gör mest för klimatet, inte minst. Och det här är inte bara någonting som vi upplever, utan någonting som har setts i siffror internationellt. Och här på bilden ser man några citat från en oberoende studie av 1800 företag internationellt som gjordes 2015. Det heter The Bottom Line. Studien jämförde företag som klimatkompenserar med liknande företag som inte klimatkompenserar, och slutsatsen var att företag som klimatkompenserar gör mer för klimatet än andra. Till exempel genom investeringar, minskningar, målsättning och energieffektivisering. So they say offsetting is an indicator of a deeper commitment to emission reductions. Så nu kommer jag till nästa fråga. Vad är klimatkompensation? Och här har vi en bild av 1 ton koldioxid, hur det ser ut i volym. Och klimatkompensation handlas i enheten 1 ton koldioxid ekvivalenter. Det tar in alla växthusgaser. Och volymen av 1 ton är den som klimatkompenseras, och det innebär att synliggöra de utsläppen och ge dem en prislapp. Så en utmaning är att klimatkompensation är en samlingsnamn för olika system. Och det kan kännas som en djungel eller en fruktdisk kanske. Eller en frukt- och grönsaksdisk. Så, men det finns, tack till ISO, en enkel definition. Det finns i ISO 14021. Och definitionen är att klimatkompensation är en mekanism för att kompensera för en produkt eller organisations klimatavtryck genom förebyggande av utsläpp, minskning eller avlägsnande av motsvarande mängd utsläpp av växthusgaser i en process utanför produktsystemets gränser. Och det är viktigt att klimatkompensation görs utanför värdekedjan. Så klimatkompensation sker i projekt. Och vi tittar här på de projekttyper som finns idag. Som i princip kan delas in i 3 grupper. Projekt som minskar, projekt som undviker eller projekt som avlägsnar utsläpp. Och projekt kan vara storskaliga eller småskaliga eller någonting emellan. Och det finns bra och dåliga projekt som vi tycker är värt att investera i, projekt som vi är tveksamma till att man är värt det. Och prislappen varierar stort, mellan $1 per ton och över $50 per ton. Och projekt med inriktning på förnybar energi, de som visas på vänstersidan här, de utgör den största volymen av klimatkompensationskrediter i världen fram till 2017. Men idag utgör den största volymen av klimatkompensation av skogsbevarande eller återskogningsprojekt. Och sen till höger ser vi lite framtiden kanske. I uppställningen till nettonollutsläpp finns nu ett fokus på negativa utsläpp, så kallade removals. Så de visualiseras på högersidan i bilden. Och här skiljer man mellan naturliga klimatlösningar, till exempel trädplantering, och tekniska lösningar. Men alla de removals-lösningar ska suga upp och binda kol. Precis som det finns olika typer av projekt finns det olika märkningar för projekt eller standarder som projekten verifieras gentemot för att säkerställa klimatnyttan. Och dessa standarder har utvecklats under många år, från 1997 till idag. Och här ser ni några av dem som ni kanske är bekant med redan. Olika standarder används i olika sammanhang, regioner och för olika typer av projekt. Och kvaliteten varierar, säger vi. Plan Vivo till exempel på vänstersidan fokuserar på skog och landanvändning. Och vi på Zero Mission fokuserar på Plan Vivo, där på vänster Gold Standard, i mitten och Fairtrade som är en add-on till Gold Standard. Så nu kommer jag till min tredje och sista fråga. Hur ska man tänka om man vill börja klimatkompensera, särskilt när det gäller kvaliteten? Man vet en del från den standarden som väljs för certifiering av projekt, men det är också viktigt, tycker vi, att kolla närmare på specifika projekt. Om man vill gå djupare här, Stockholm Environment Institute har skrivit en guide till offsetting för att hjälpa företag undvika låg kvalitet, som är en bra oberoende källa. Och här inne tar man upp 3 aspekter för att bedöma kvalitet. Först pris, som allting i livet, som är ofta en indikation för kvalitet. Och sen vintage, som betyder åldern av krediterna. Och till sist den balansen, säger de, mellan möjliga risker och mervärden. Och ett viktigt budskap från detta dokument är att det finns ofta trade-offs mellan olika aspekter. Till exempel, pris kan vara lägre för äldre krediter, men de saknar additionalitet till exempel. Och projekt som ser ut att ha lägsta risker saknar ofta mervärden, till exempel för lokala miljön eller för samhället. Så det är inte så lätt kanske att välja rätt. Man behöver titta närmare och välja vad det är viktigt för er. Och på Zero Mission väljer vi projekt som uppfyller våra kriterier. Till exempel det Mangrove-projektet som ni kommer höra om snart. Så vi vill att projekt är väl förankrade bland lokala aktörer och projektdeltagare. Vi vill att projekt är utformade på att ge en långsiktig effekt på flera fronter än bara klimat. Till exempel att människor får en bättre livskvalitet och hälsa, nya arbetstillfällen skapas och kunskap och teknik överföras. Och samt vill vi att projekt har en hög grad av additionalitet. Det betyder att de inte kommer att ske utan den pengar som flödar till projekten genom klimatkompensation. Så tittar vi på till exempel vem äger projekt och driver projekten. Oftast är det NGO och sociala entreprenörer. Och vi kollar om projekten verkligen behöver den pengar som kommer in från försäljning av klimatkompensationskrediter. Så, sammanfattningen tycker jag är att det finns mycket att lära om klimatkompensation. Mycket som är spännande tycker vi. Och det finns mycket gott att göra med klimatkompensation både på hemmaplan och ute i världen. Klimatkompensation behövs för att vi ska klara målen i Parisavtalet och det finns stora fördelar med att komma igång redan idag. Och med den vill jag lämna över tillbaka till Ida först kanske.
Tack Claire. Innan du försvinner bara, finns det något som du skulle vilja repetera kanske och säga till företag som funderar på att använda klimatkompensation som en del av sin klimatstrategi? Vad ska man tänka på?
Ja, det är en bra fråga. Jag tycker man ska tänka på i första hand varför vill man göra det. Tycker jag det är viktigt att ha det förankrat internt till exempel. Att det är någonting som alla stödjer. Och sen vad syftar man till med den? Så att vara ledande i branschen kanske, eller att få koll på utsläpp, eller bidra till framtidens generationer till exempel. Alla de kan vara bra anledningar till att göra det, även att få en märkning på någonting till exempel. Så att tänka först, varför vill vi göra det här?
Tack för din presentation. Du kan stänga av din kamera så länge och så ska vi välkomna Mark Huxham in på scen. Mark, you can turn on your camera please. You are a professor in environmental biology at the Edinburgh Napier University, but you're also a trustee of the project Vanga Blue Forest in Mikoka Pamoja in Kenya and the organization Association for Coastal Ecosystem Services. And I'll just kind of hand over to you. Please share your presentation.
Thank you, Ida, and hello to everyone. It's nice to join you this morning from Scotland. Can I just check that you're seeing that screen okay, Ash and Ida?
Yep, that's perfect, Mark.
Great.
Go ahead.
So I'd like to talk just briefly this morning, first of all, about blue carbon and what blue carbon means. Secondly, about why that has an important contribution to nature-based solutions in tackling the climate emergency. And then thirdly, I'd like to just give you the examples of the 2 projects that we helped to run in southern Kenya. And both of those projects have been supported over the years by Zero Emissions. So it's very nice to have this opportunity to work with them and to speak to you. So I'm going to start with the big picture. And I know that Claire has already mentioned this a little bit. I'm using slightly different units than Claire. I'm talking about units of carbon rather than CO2. But at the moment, human beings are putting 11.5 gigatons of carbon, that's 11.5 billion tons of carbon, into the atmosphere every year. And most of that comes from the burning of fossil fuels, but a substantial proportion, around 1.5 gigatons, comes from land use change, in particular from the destruction of forests. And it's quite hard to picture just how much carbon that is. I was impressed, I'm sure all of us were, with the size of that boat that just got caught in the Suez Canal. That was a big ship. Well, if you take ships like that and line them up from bow to stern in a continuous line, stretching all the way around the planet 42 times, that would be about enough ships to carry the carbon that we emit into the atmosphere every year. So that's the kind of scale of the problem that we're dealing with. So what happens to the carbon that we release into the atmosphere? Well, as we know, much of it accumulates, which of course is bringing us our acute crisis with climate change. But in fact, only around 50% of the carbon that's emitted stays in the atmosphere for more than a year or two. The rest of the carbon is taken up by natural ecosystems. So around just over 3 gigatons of carbon is absorbed by terrestrial ecosystems, in particular by forests, and 2.6 gigatons is absorbed by the oceans. So some of that 2.6 gigatons is absorbed by what we call blue carbon ecosystems. And it's important to make that point because what it shows is that without those ecosystems, without the effects of natural ecosystems, climate change would be running two times as seriously as it is at the moment. So we rely very, very heavily on natural ecosystems to mitigate the effects that we're having on the climate. I'm just going to briefly show this slide, which is taken from the IPCC 2018 report on achieving 1.5 degrees. So the world's nations have agreed under the Paris Agreement to aspire to keep temperatures down to 1.5 degrees. And what that means in practice is very, very rapid carbon emissions. This slide shows 2 pathways, pathway 1 and pathway 2, that we could use to achieve 1.5 degrees. Pathway 1 is by far the most desirable pathway, and that's because it does not assume technologies that do not really exist at the moment, so-called BECCS technologies. So pathway 1 is where we want to be, and I guess the 2 things to notice about this diagram are, first of all, the very, very, very steep decline that we need to achieve in emissions of around 7 to 8% per year. That's about the same as we've achieved this year through, well, we didn't achieve it, but COVID achieved it for us. So that gives us an idea of the scale of emissions reductions that we need to work on. But the other thing on this figure that I want to point to is the brown area here. So this is forestry, and as you can see at the moment, forestry contributes to emissions, but by 2050 or so, we need forestry to be taking carbon up. In other words, we need to reverse the loss of forests, and we need to have established many more new natural forests. And in fact, we need around the equivalent of 9.5 million square kilometers of more forestry across the world under this pathway. So that brings me to blue carbon. Blue carbon is the organic carbon that's trapped by vegetation in the oceans. There are 3 ecosystems that can do this very effectively. Mangroves, and those are forests that grow in the tropics and subtropics in the intertidal zone. There are about 140,000 square kilometers of forests across the world. Seagrass, and on this diagram you can see both of those, on this figure you can see both of those ecosystems, mangroves above, and these plants here are seagrass. We do have seagrass in Europe as well. You do in Sweden and we do in Scotland, but they don't tend to look like these lovely lush tropical seagrass. Seagrass, you can see, is a much smaller plant, but it covers a bigger area than mangroves, about 267,000 square kilometers. The third ecosystem is salt marsh, which again we have in temperate regions and some in the tropics as well. So these 3 ecosystems are very effective at trapping carbon and, as I'll show you, at burying them. Now, I've just told you the global area of mangrove forests, and 160,000 square kilometers might sound large, but in fact, compared to the total area of tropical forestry, that's less than 1%. So here's mangroves and here is tropical forestry. And so given that very relatively small proportion of total forestry, that might imply that mangroves are relatively unimportant when we're thinking about nature-based solutions. But that's not the right conclusion, because when we look at the carbon that is buried below ground in forests in the tropics, this is the picture that we have. So although mangroves are a very small area, they bury around 30% of all the carbon that is buried below ground. And I'm emphasizing below ground because that's the safest kind of carbon when we're thinking about nature-based solutions. It's relatively permanently sequestered carbon. So the point there is that mangrove forests, and to a lesser extent seagrass and salt marsh, are extremely effective at capturing carbon and at burying it. One of the reasons for this is that mangroves are able to do a really fantastic trick that we've only really discovered over the last 2 decades, and that's by adjusting the level of the forest floor in the face of sea level rise. So the seas are rising around the world at around just over 3 millimeters per year. And of course, that's a really serious problem for any coastal ecosystem, and indeed for people living on the coast. And what mangroves are able to do, mangroves have these incredible aerial roots that they need in order to anchor them into the mud, and also to keep oxygen coming into their roots. If the sea level goes up, a healthy mangrove forest can respond by generating more roots like that. And these roots act to trap sediment, the sediment or soil that is coming from rivers, but also in from the ocean. And that sediment is full of mud and full of carbon. So what happens is that the sediment surface, the surface floor of the forest increases, and that traps more mud and therefore traps more carbon. So you elevate the floor and you trap more carbon below ground. So that's a really efficient mechanism, and it means that the forests can keep up with sea level rise, as well as continuing to trap carbon into the future. Even a mature mangrove forest will carry on capturing more carbon. This is what it looks like. Here's a close-up of a mangrove root area, and on this picture you can see, well, This black stuff is mud, very carbon-rich mud. There are lots of living roots in here. There are dead roots. There's mangrove. Here's a mangrove propagule. That will become a mangrove tree if it grows. There's also bits of seagrass in here. So there's all sorts of carbon coming down from the land and in from the ocean being captured here. And if we look at the total proportions of carbon in this mangrove forest, this is what we see. This diagram shows the proportional distribution of carbon. The white area up here is the carbon that's contained in the trees, what you can see, and all of this is the carbon that's buried below ground. And at our site in Kenya, there's around 1,500 tons of carbon per hectare buried below ground. So that's a really astonishingly high concentration of carbon in a small area. So just to introduce you to our sites, we're now going to close to the close to the equator, down in Kenya, and our sites here are in the southern coast of Kenya, close to the Tanzanian border. In fact, this site here, Vanga, is right on the Tanzanian border. And both of these communities are extremely beautiful places with coral reefs, with seagrass, and of course with mangrove forests. One of the key things about working in mangrove forests is that mostly around the world, these are socio-ecological systems. And what I mean by that is they are systems in which people are very intimately involved. And so you cannot work to conserve or expand or restore these systems without working very closely with the people who are part of them. So people in this area have, of course, have used and managed their ecosystems for millennia, but recently forest loss has been accelerating over the last 4 to 5 decades. Most people here use wood every day for cooking, and much of that wood comes from the mangroves. Most people rely on fishing for their livelihood, and one of the implications of that, linked to that actually, is relatively low educational attainments for the people here. And the population growth rates are very high on the Kenyan coast. Some of that, much of that is new people. Some of it is migration from inland in Kenya, which itself is perhaps a climate change impact. So the projects that we run there, they're focused on mangroves, although they do now include seagrass as well. And part of that is forest planting, mangrove planting, which is something that we've been doing for 20 years at these sites now. It's very important to do that. We're restoring degraded areas of forest, but from a carbon perspective, that has a fairly small, or at least a fairly slow impact, because these trees take a while to grow. It's also the case that you should plant trees in areas where the trees will not recover naturally. And what that means is that those areas are often quite harsh, they're quite degraded. In our case, they have high levels of salt, where people have removed forests many years ago. And that means that many of the trees die before they're established. So it's a slow and difficult process to restore ecosystems. It's a very important process, but it doesn't bring rapid carbon benefits. So most of what we do is about avoiding deforestation of the forests that are there already. And before launching these projects, we needed to establish a baseline, which is the case with most nature-based solution carbon projects. So this is a business as usual, a BAU scenario. And if you we used satellite imagery and risk mapping to look at what was happening to Kenyan's mangrove forests. And this is the area, that's the area near Mombasa, the biggest town on the coast. And actually all of these mangroves, given current trends, were predicted to disappear. So rates of loss were very high in Kenya. before we launched these projects. So what's happened since project launch? We use a series of fairly simple indicators to show that we're having an effect on forest loss and on carbon accumulation in the forest that we're able to protect. One of the best indicators actually is just stump counts. They're very, very easy to take. And so these forests are degraded. They were being cut illegally, sometimes at a small scale, sometimes by a much bigger scale, lorries turning up from out of town, and people just clear felling areas of the forest, for example. So although it's illegal to cut mangroves in Kenya, it was very common in these areas. So this diagram just shows you what's happened to the stump counts in our forest plots since we started. And that gives us a very good indication that people are no longer going into these areas and cutting. This is the above ground biomass in the plots. Because the forest was degraded, was cut, it means that it's a damaged forest, and that means that there's potential for the forest to recover and to grow. So this, I talked a lot about below ground, but this is just above ground carbon, and you can see that the forest plots have shown really good growth in carbon since we started this project, Mkoko Pamoja. This is a bit of a confusing slide, but it's deliberately confusing in the sense that I'm just showing you there are many people involved in these projects. And actually, one of the key things of working with Plan Vivo as the standard is that Plan Vivo emphasizes partnership with the local people, partnership with the Kenyan government, and of course, partnership with people like Zero Mission. So this is showing you that the kind of organization, the social organization that we're working with in Mkoko Pamoja. ACES is the charity here in Scotland that helps administer sales. Of course, there are buyers of sales, there's the standard, and then there's a local community-based organization which runs the project in Kenya. A brief comment on money. So the money that buyers of carbon credits pay to the charity ACES gets transferred down these various routes. There are fixed costs for the money. ACES is a charity, so it's not making any profits for itself, which means that most of the income that we get can be transferred to the community, in this case, Vanga Blue Carbon community organization. And the community directly benefits by having a community pot of money, a community fund, and they vote on what that money is spent on. So in this case, for example, they decided to support period poverty in local schools. So that's a democratic process by which local people decide how to spend their money. There have been multiple social benefits of these projects over the years. Many of them have been focused on education and water and health. So for example, here's a water point at Makengeni School. This school had no access to drinkable water before the project, which is quite astonishing if you think of 400 children going to school every day with no access to water in the tropical heat. So these decisions are made by local people depending on local priorities. So thank you very much for listening to me. As I say, these two projects, Mkoko Pamoja has now been running since 2013. Vanga Blue Forest, the second project, the sister project, has been running since 2019. And as ACES, we have plans to, of course, support these projects, but also expand into other areas as well.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. You mentioned that the business as usual scenario, if these projects would not have existed, was a 76% tree cover loss. Is that correct?
That's correct for southern Kenya, yes.
That's quite astonishing. What do you think has been the most difficult things in the process of implementing these projects?
Difficult. The most delicate and important thing is working with people and building trust. Now, that's not necessarily the most difficult thing, but it's the most important thing. So in the sense that it's easy to get that wrong, and it's something that many people rush. So because I personally have been working at this site for 20 years now, and my main Kenyan colleague and friend, James Cairo, lives at the site. He's been living there for 35 years. What that means is that we have very good relationships with everybody locally. And so there's a lot of trust involved. What you're asking people to do in these projects is, well, make some sacrifices for you, and also possibly to take some risks. We're asking people to look out, to patrol. The way this works is that the policing of the project and the management of the project comes down to local volunteers, local people. So they have to be looking out for their own forests. And that involves organization and some degree of risk. So they have to trust you that that's going to be worthwhile.
And how has the project been received by the local community?
So it's been very successful. We've had, as part of the Plan Vivo standard, as part of the registration, you need to show that you've got local support and that there are social benefits of these projects. But we're also lucky because we've had many visitors to this project, international and national visitors, including some independent scientists coming to review how we're doing. So it's been very successful. In fact, one of our challenges now is we get so much interest in the project from other communities, and the challenge is how we can support them. So many people along the Kenyan coast and elsewhere want to replicate this work.
It's nice to know. Do you know of any similar projects around in Kenya or elsewhere?
So at the moment, the only two projects in Kenya for mangroves are our two projects. We support work in Gambia, which is community-based mangrove planting. Tahira Honka, which is a project in Madagascar, is a similar project, and that was partly inspired by our work. So there are a few other projects, but we're still quite unusual.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to come back later, but now we're going to see a switch to Swedish now. Vi ska få se en intervju med Moana Brucey, Moana Africa, som är projektsamordnare för projektet Blue Vanga, som Mark pratade lite om. Och som jag nämnde tidigare så hade vi hemskt gärna velat ha med Moana Brucey idag, men uppkopplingen är lite skakig från projektsajten där Moana Brucey sitter. Så därför har vi valt att spela in den här intervjun i förhand. And Mark, you can turn off your camera. Thank you. Och jag glömde nämna inledningsvis att ställ gärna frågor i Q&A eller chatten, så tar vi jättegärna upp dem. Så att gör det, inga frågor är dumma. Så nu ska vi se om vi kan kicka igång en video. Thank you so much for agreeing to participating in this interview. It's very nice to get in contact with you. You are the project coordinator for the Blue Vanga project.
Yes.
In the Association for Coastal Ecosystem Services. Yes. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role within the project?
Okay. First of all, my name is Moana Brucey, Africa, the project coordinator of Vanga Blue Forest. I did get into job last year, but that was 2019, December. So currently I've worked for about 1 year and some few months. And part of my role being the project coordinator is coordinating with access in terms of the carbon cells, in terms of the information that I'm supposed to collect from the project area, that is the scientific information. I'm supposed to store it, collect it first of all, store it, and also relay the information to access. The other thing is to liaise with the community in terms of any information within the project. Okay, do you get me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing, I'm the administrative officer within the area, because the area governs 3 villages, that is Vanga, Jimbo, and Kiwegu. So it does stand for the 3 villages. The other thing is to stand for the money that is collected from the carbon cells. I am in charge of allocating it to the different employees within the organization.
Lovely. I just wanted to ask about your life in the project area. Do you live in close proximity to the projects?
Yes, I live within the project area. So there is that first-hand information, and also, let's say, I live just close within the village area.
Oh, so you actually live within one of the villages that participate in the project?
Yeah.
Right? Wow.
Yes.
How big part is it? Do you think that the replanting is 10% and the rest, and preserving is 90%, or what would you say?
Okay, I would like to touch on that also. You see, for the planting activities, that is the restoration activities, we are about to do that. That is next month. That's on our work plan. So last year we didn't do planting, but then within the area itself, the people do have these environmental groups, which they usually do the planting activities. But as for the project, we will begin our planting, that is the restoration activities, this year.
Wow, and how many people does that involve? How many people are involved in the replanting activities?
It's usually a group of almost 50 people.
Oh, and that's people from the communities coming in to plant.
Yeah.
It's exciting that you're doing this for the first time. I would love to visit the project as well. So what do you think are the biggest, what's the biggest difference that the project has made or the project will make for the environment, do you think?
Okay, so as I told you earlier, we haven't begun the restoration activities, but we are supposed to begin this coming month. So we state that for the substantial benefits that we foresee that this project will bring into the community. So first of all, it's the climate change impact. With the carbon that we'll be preserving within our forest, we presume that we're gonna create a positive impact within the climate change atmosphere. Okay, that is one. Then the other impact is the increasing, sorry for that. The other thing is that we are going to increase the fisheries stocks within the area, because as you can see, when we preserve these mangrove forests, and we've said that the mangrove forests are basically the nursery or the breeding areas for quite a big number of the fisheries, types of fishery. So we are anticipating that also the fishery stocks is going to increase in terms of numbers. In terms of the project, we anticipate that we are also going to employ more employees, because as I've said right now, we have only 2 forest scouts with 2 forest scouts who are manning this particular area, that is the mangrove forest. And as of now, mangrove forest has a total coverage of 4,428 hectares, but the project site is within 460 hectares only. But you see, for the forest scouts, not only man the area within our project sites, no, they do man the entire forest acreage, area, within the Vanga area. So we anticipate that with the successful sale of our carbon credits and also the expansion of the project, we anticipate that we are going to increase the number of forest scouts to continue increasing the surveillance within the mangrove forest. And this will have a positive impact within the area because we will be seeking the employees directly from the community which we are living in right now.
Oh, so you're actually fully employing people from the project area and involving them within the project.
Exactly. So we will be like creating employment opportunities for the project, for the community within our area.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
Why do you think, I mean, it might be obvious, but why do you think projects like these, like the Mikoko Pamoja project and the Blue Vanga Forest, needs to exist?
I do think it's there are projects which they do have a very significant impact to the environment, first of all, because as you can see now, it's like everybody's singing out climate change. But then with these projects, they do have a positive impact because, as I've said, from the carbon stores or from the carbon sequestration, which is the main activity within these two projects, that is the Vanga project and the Vanga Blue Forest project and the Mikoko Pamoja project. With these two projects, they do sequester or they do channeling so much carbon, which mitigates the climate change impact. So I would say that these projects do play a very great role. That is one. Two, I will say that not only do they support the science part or the environment part, they do also give in back to the community, because you can't tell somebody not to cut down a tree, yet you have no benefit maybe giving back to that person, you see. But then with these two projects, they do have the tangible impact that you can see that the community directly benefits. That is in terms of health-wise, in terms of education-wise, yeah.
That's lovely to hear. Is there anything that you would like to say to any potential buyers of carbon credits?
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that it's good. And first of all, I would like actually to thank those buyers who have been supporting our sister project, that is Mikoko Pamoja. And I would also like to invite them to also support the Vanga Blue Forest project, to also invest in our business, because we will be nowhere without the buyers.
Okay, det var det. I would like to now invite Claire and Mark onto the stage again. We have some questions coming in from the Q&A. Mark, a question for you. The participants in the projects in the local environment, the people living in this local environment, they're chopping down the mangroves for some reason. What's replacing that if they can't take down the mangroves anymore?
There were three main reasons for mangrove destruction in the area. The first is, if you like, very just small scale incremental cutting, particularly for fuel wood. The second was local people using mangroves for their own housing, so for timber supplies. And then the third was incursions from outside. Some of those incursions quite well organized, and some, frankly, through kind of corrupt contacts with forestry officials. So that the big incursions, the outside incursions, we were able to prevent by, well, through negotiation and through, Wanarusi was talking about the forest scouts. So those are people who are paid by the project to patrol and to watch out for those kinds of incursions. The cutting by local people, if you ask people, are you cutting? They always say no, but most of their houses are built by mangroves. So that kind of small scale cutting, it's technically illegal. And the way we deal with that is by growing alternative sources of fuel wood and timber. So there are woodlots on our sites which produce timber, which then belongs to the community.
Mm. And another question was, what are the resources that you need to expand these projects?
The main, as I've emphasized, the project only works if you have support from local people. And I should say these forests belong to the Kenyan government. And so then, of course, they're not our forests. And the local communities can have tenureship of these forests under Kenyan law. So you need that high-level government support as well as the community support. So all of that takes time. And one of the challenges is the pressure to scale up sometimes means that people try to skip that part. So I think you have to have communities that are willing to work. And often, you know, I'm aware of many communities actually that have already organized, that do their own mangrove planting with no resources, and do their best to keep illegal cutting out of their forests. People understand the importance of these forests. Wanarusi talked about fisheries, for example. So local fishers know that the forests are important for them. And what they need is a little bit of resource to help them do that. So as a charity, we have a lot of expertise in, for example, achieving accreditation. I'm a scientist, so I can bring scientific expertise, but I guess the main bottleneck is having the resources on the ground to do that long-term capacity building.
Thank you. Another question was, what are the greatest obstacles to exporting the successes from these projects to other countries and areas? Thinking of the East Coast, such as Tanzania, and West African countries, such as Liberia. And what is the need for more initiatives to protect mangroves to take place?
So there's a really big opportunity now under international climate policy through so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And some of our work in a different context actually is to look at those countries around the world that have mangrove forests and that could include mangrove conservation in their national contributions and commitments. So we have a big focus at the moment on what will happen, we hope will happen in Glasgow in November of this year, when people come together for the COP. And a lot of our work is to try and encourage other countries to include mangroves in their NDCs. If they do that, of course, there are still those challenges of how you bring communities along and encourage and support communities. But there's a big opportunity for us in Blue Carbon to really raise the status of mangroves.
And what about places that doesn't have mangroves? Like, could you implement a project like this with seagrass in Europe?
Yes, you could. So we, you saw seagrass there in Kenya, and as I said, we have two species of seagrass here in Scotland, the same species you have in Sweden, in fact.
The yucky ones.
But they're only small, yes. Sometimes they're called eelgrass. They're a great habitat. The challenge with seagrass is that there's much less carbon there. So I talked about 1,500 tons of carbon in the mangroves. Typically in a seagrass bed here in Scotland, we might have 100 tons per hectare, which means that you need far more area of seagrass to make the finances work. So there's a strong argument for conserving seagrass around carbon, but the temperate seagrass tends to have smaller amounts of carbon. I guess what we want is a world that conserves important ecosystems, not only because of carbon. Seagrass is very important for fisheries and other ecosystem services too. But yes, you can use carbon in carbon. Sorry, you can use seagrass in carbon projects, and in fact, we now include seagrass as one of the ecosystems in Makoko Pomoja.
We also have a question about leakage. How is leakage addressed in the project? If the project areas are protected and no more illegal logging can take place there, does that not mean that the deforestation just happens somewhere else?
So part of the answer to that is what I've already said about the woodlots. We have data on how much wood people need from the forest, and that gives us information on how many trees we need to plant. So these are terrestrial trees providing that resource. The other part of the answer is a kind of positive leakage. Wanarusi said actually that although we're not technically protecting the whole forest, because there's now high profile community patrols and everybody in the area knows the importance of mangroves and understands the benefits that they're getting, the material benefits in terms of the community funds from sale of credits. There's much better protection of the forest as a whole. And we don't see those people turning up and clear cutting anymore. So there's a kind of positive leakage, and in that sense, these sites are good sites to work at because the pressure on the forest is not so intense that it's impossible to prevent it. Some of those areas near Mombasa would be much harder to work with because the population pressures on the forest are so intense.
Thank you. Claire, do you have any final thoughts and reflections on either the presentation with Wanarusi or the Mark's presentation or the interview with Wanarusi? Is there anything that you would like to say, reflect on?
Well, actually, as usual, when we have close contact with our projects, I get very inspired. And there were quite a few things that were new and extra inspiring in Mark's and Yamarusi's presentations. The first that I noted was that, Mark, you're saying that these mangroves have this extraordinary ability to actually raise the height of the ground, basically. And that's just amazing because it's actually mitigation and adaptation all happening at the same thing. And where coastal populations are vulnerable, the benefit of having having an ecosystem that can protect itself against the sea level rise that we're causing is wonderful. And then I was also struck by what you said, Mark, that the people are part of the system. And I think here, perhaps in Northern Europe, we're not so, perhaps Sweden's pretty good, but we're not so good at thinking of ourselves as humans as part of ecological systems. And that's a lesson I think we need to get back to. And remember, we are part of a socio-ecological system, which you talked about there, Mark. And then I was also struck by the fact that mangrove forests keep sequestering carbon. I'm not the scientist that you are, Mark, and so but as I understand it, there are often sort of a leveling out of the sequestering of carbon in other types of forests, whereas mangrove just go on and on and on and on, sequestering more carbon, even when the trees are adult. So that was very nice to hear, and therefore I guess that impact that mangroves, despite their small area in the world, actually mangrove forests contain so much more carbon than typical tropical forest. So those were some of my new insights, I would say, into the project, and just how fantastic it is to be working with those kind of things.
I'm gonna let that be the final thoughts for today. Thank you so much both Claire and Mark for participating, och tack till alla ni som har lyssnat. Innan ni hoppar ut så vill jag bara göra reklam för att vi kommer att ha mera seminarium under våren. Det är ett Fairtrade-seminarium den 6/5 som vi kommer att ha tillsammans med Fairtrade Sverige, och sen så kommer vi också ha ett seminarium tillsammans med Zero som kommer att fokusera på tjänsteresor och pendlingsresor och att minska utsläppen från dem i juni. Så tack till alla ni som har lyssnat och bye bye!